I originally presented this speech at the Simon Fraser University Advocacy for Men and Boys event, She for He, on April 23rd at the Vancouver City campus of Simon Fraser University. During the United States 2004 presidential elections, Professor Drew Weston placed committed Republicans and Democrats in fMRI machines and recorded their brain states as they were presented with a series of 7 slides. The statements in each set of slides were attributed to either George Bush or John Kerry. The first slide presented an initial statement, the second presented a statement contradictory to the first. The remaining slides determined how much the subjects felt the 2 statements were in contradiction, with a 5th slide adding a potential explanation for the contradiction. The subjects' responses depended entirely on their political alignment. If the candidate making the inconsistent statement was not from their political party, their cold reasoning parts of their brain lit up and they correctly identified the inconsistency. But if the candidate making the inconsistent statement was from their party, their brain lit up with distress, and the distress was quickly clamped down on by a process called motivated reasoning. In this process, our neural circuitry recruits beliefs that allow us to eliminate emotional distress. We rationalize away any identity-threatening facts. We cherry-pick from our experiences, from the things we've told, from the things that we believe in order to resolve the cognitive dissonance. The partisans' brains went even further than easing the distress. After their rationalization was successful, their reward circuits started to turn on, giving them a shot of dopamine. Other researchers in the field have also found that there's something called a backlash effect, in which facts contradictory to your belief system only serve to reinforce your beliefs, likely through that aforementioned reward system. You see an inconsistent fact, or a fact inconsistent with your ideology, you experience distress, you rationalize, and the process of rationalizing gives you a shot of pleasure. And why am I talking about all of this in a speech regarding men's issues? Because the reality is that setting a bunch of facts before you will only convince you if you are already convinced of my point. If you're not, those facts are only more likely to strengthen your opposing beliefs. And as deep as our partisan political beliefs go, our beliefs about gender go even deeper. And since I'm pretty much not going to be able to do anything to change anyone's mind, I guess I better pack it in. Turn off the video recorder, turn off the lights, get by, good luck that nothing's going to be achieved here. I thank you for your kind attention, but if the battle lines are drawn, nothing can be done. What can you do? But since I have gone to all of the trouble of putting up the video recorder, getting made up, putting on my good clothes, putting out the lights, and writing the script, I might as well try to do something about this particular catch-22. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come at this from a point where we all can agree on, from some common ground. Because facts won't convince anyone of anything, and we can't agree on the facts, let's start from a place we all agree on. And that place is women's well-being. Almost no one on the men's right side is interested in keeping women from a seat at the compassion table. And I'm sure feminists can relate to a desire to make sure women aren't being hurt. So let's start there. Let's start with women's well-being. Instead of talking about what women can do for men's rights, I'm going to start to talk about what men's rights gave me as a woman. I have an anxiety disorder and a type of social phobia that manifests very much like agoraphobia. An anxiety disorder is characterized by feelings of apprehension, uncertainty, or fear. The word is derived from the Latin angere, which means to choke, throttle, strangle, and probably mispronounce terribly. Very appropriate, since that's exactly what my phobia did to my life. For long periods of time, my fear prevented me from crossing the threshold of my house into the outside world. When it was really bad, it restricted me to a single room in my home. What's terrifying about an attack is that it can strike at any moment. My life became a series of escape routes and bolt holes. Wherever I went, I could have told you exactly how to get to the nearest bathroom or alcove, the nearest place you could hide. Fear is a more powerful and complete loss of freedom than any social or legal limitation. Those are external. Fear you take wherever you go. And I'm telling you this to explain how devastating fear is. But as bad as my phobia and panic attacks are or were, now that I'm at the tail end of 3 years of intensive therapy, and I'm able to sit in front of a room of people and tell them about my fear, able to go halfway across a continent and do a speech, as bad as clawing myself out of that abyss of fear was, I have to confess that I'm thankful for my fear. And not because of what I learned from it, which was a lot, but because of what it saved me from. In our society, fear is a valuable commodity. Specifically, women's fear is a valuable commodity. According to an extremely unsurprising study done during World War II by the US government, the use of women and children in danger was found to be an effective motivator for action. And this is from the study How to Make Posters That Will Help Win the War, from the Office of Facts and Figures. Yes, they had to pay to do a study to find that out. Pretty obvious, but yeah, it's the government. This rhetoric speaks to something deep inside all of us. Women are vulnerable and need their men's protection. The damsel in distress is a classic trope, and it's a classic trope because it works so well to establish motivation. We hear a woman in fear, we need to save her. As a political tool, women's fear is useful for knee-jerk motivation. After Professor Drew Weston concluded his research into the true nature of political reasoning during the 2004 presidential election, in which the Democrats lost, he offered some very important words of wisdom to the Democrats. Learn from the Republican example. Republicans don't appeal to issues, they appeal to emotions. Is it a coincidence that in the 12 years since Professor Weston published his research and made his appeal to Democrats, Democrats have adopted the following rhetoric to oppose Republicans? If you're gonna go emotional, you might as well go for broke. From promoting social and legal policy like prohibition to justifying war to cutthroat partisan politics, women's fear is a very useful political weapon. But women's fear is not just a potent political weapon. It's also a form of currency. To many industries, women's fear is a valuable revenue stream because it not only motivates people to act, it also motivates them to donate. My brother is autistic. 90% of the people who have autism are boys. Because of my brother, my family received materials from societies devoted to the study, care, and awareness of autism. But when I was looking through the materials related to autism, I noticed something very startling. More often than not, these groups had chosen a girl to be the face of autism. That was just one instance. Over the years, I noticed many others. When I was taking my master's in environmental design at the University of Calgary, there was an exhibition on homelessness, specifically an exhibition on homeless women. One of the assertions at the exhibition was as follows: as a minority group within the homeless population, women have needs for comfort, privacy, and safety that are not currently being served. As I looked at the materials on the situation, it occurred to me that if treating women identically to men wasn't providing for their comfort, privacy, and safety, then how was it providing for men's? I was then invited to support an initiative to purchase baskets of luxury items such as makeup for homeless women in shelters. Just Detention International used to be called Stop Prison Rape. When it was Stop Prison Rape, the website included a gallery of testimonials from male prisoners. Some of the men even explained that being able to tell their stories on the Stop Prison Rape site was the first time they ever felt heard, because they had no one else to tell them to. When Stop Prison Rape became Just Detention International, most of the stories from male prisoners disappeared and were replaced by stories with a very specific theme. They were stories by women of having been abused by male guards. Now, if you've looked at the statistics regarding sexual abuse of prisoners in the U.S., you'll know that women abused by male guards is both in number and proportion the least common form of abuse. The most common form of abuse in terms of proportion and total number of victims is female staff abusing male inmates. The second most common form of abuse proportionately is female prisoners abusing each other. The third most common form of abuse is male prisoners abusing other male prisoners. And bringing up the rear is male staff abusing female prisoners. Now, there's no form of sexual abuse in prison that should be ignored, but I find it remarkable that Just Detention International purged its site of male stories in favor of focusing on the least common form of victimization. The least common, but the one that resonates best with our notion of woman as victim and man as villain. I got a dark glimpse into what was going on here, with all these initiatives finding a way to emphasize women and girls as victims and minimize men and boys, when I read a Guardian article from 2013 on the hidden victims of wartime rape. This Guardian article explored the rape of men in wartime. A recent study on sexual violence in the Congo has found that nearly as many men as women report having been subject to rape. There's an important caveat to consider when looking at that statistic. If you listen to the stories of male rape victims, they often have an addendum that women do not. The men will talk about being gang raped multiple times a day by multiple assailants, tell stories of watching other prisoners, other men bleed to death from the injuries they sustained. They'll tell horrendous stories of sexual torture, such as being forced to put their penis in acidic sap that would stick to the skin and burn into their flesh. But their addendum was unique to men and often went like this. Then after days, weeks, months of this treatment, my captors would split my head open with a machete and leave me in a ditch for dead. For many of the male survivors, they didn't just survive sexual violation. The sexual violation culminated in a murder attempt that they survived against all odds. As an African woman in a refugee camp once explained to an aid worker why she went out to gather supplies instead of her father, her husband, her brothers, she said, "They will only rape me. They will kill them." When we look at the statistics regarding the rape of men in the Congo, and we find that not as many men report it, we have to consider that dead men don't tell tales. The Guardian article on the rape of men in the Congo went on to mention very briefly that one aid organization was working with male victims, one of the very few that could offer them anything substantial at all. And this aid organization was warned by Dutch Oxfam that if more than 30% of their resources ever went to male victims, their funding would be yanked. You might be coming to the conclusion right now that sympathy for male victims and sympathy for female victims is a zero-sum game. And if you are, you're wrong. It's worse than a zero-sum game. I recently had a short exchange with a feminist on Twitter. He insisted that Abrahamic religions were deeply misogynist. I replied that I believed that they were also discriminatory against men in various respects. And he said to me, "Why are you apologizing for them?" I was gobsmacked by that. Here I just said Abrahamic religions potentially discriminated against women and men, essentially doubling the number of victims. And he said that was apologizing for them. It took me a while to untangle his thinking, but then it clicked. Using a girl's face for a disorder that overwhelmingly affects boys, removing male prisoner testimonials in favor of female, how Dutch Oxfam threatened to cut an aid organization's funding if they offered treatment to too many men, and finally saying that pointing out Abrahamic faiths negatively affecting men too is somehow excusing them. It all clicked. When we recognize a crime, an atrocity, a calamity affects men as much as it affects women, that problem actually recedes in importance. In other words, if we have 50 female victims, and then we find out there are also 50 male victims, we lose sympathy for all the victims. Those 50 female victims aren't now having to compete with those 50 male victims for resources. No, it's far worse. All 100 victims get 0 resources because now no one cares to give them any. The competition between male victims and female victims isn't a zero-sum game. It's a negative-sum game. If men are recognized, women are left in the dark too. Somehow our sympathy is tied to the idea that women suffer uniquely, that it's far more of an injustice if something is done to women and only women because they're women. The idea triggers a sense of violation more profound than if it affects both men and women equally, even if, in the second case, there are far more victims overall. So there's a strong incentive, even an understandable incentive, for aid and relief organizations to ignore male victims, omit them from their advocacy, and quietly shuffle them out of view. And who can blame them in our current climate? Wouldn't it be better to give proper help to those 50 women, even if it means those 50 male victims get an aspirin and a shove out the door, if they're lucky? As you can see, women's fear is a very valuable commodity as a political weapon, as a call to action, and as a sales pitch. It can be turned like a scalpel to excise subcultures dominant institutions don't like, or it can be used to justify bombing entire countries because they, quote, don't treat their women right, end quote, so let's kill them all. I guess that's the extreme version of Dutch Oxfam's logic. If they treat too many men, let's get rid of their funding. And because women's fear is so effective in motivating a society to lose all reason in pursuit of saving women, there's an even darker side to the use of women's fear. Because the use of women's fear is behind some of the worst atrocities and systematic discriminations in human history. But does the fear economy have a cost? The obvious cost is that in order to maintain the profitable illusion that only women are victims, male victims have to be ignored. And of course, I think we can all agree that women's fear can be exaggerated, even invented out of whole cloth. I highly doubt the threat black men posed to white Southern womanhood was quite as bad as all that, and I imagine that the menace Jewish men presented to German women was a tad overblown. So we know governments and organizations have lied about the true scope of the threat to women in order to push unsavory and violent agendas. We also know those agendas have resulted in some of the worst atrocities of human history. Now consider the young African woman who explained that she'd rather gather supplies than have her male relatives go, because she just faced rape, they faced murder. Do you think she would appreciate knowing that her father, brother, sons are being deliberately ignored by relief agencies when they need help? I doubt it. Treating one half of a community also does nothing to end a problem. It's like treating one half of someone's body. If the men aren't also treated for their trauma, the women in their community suffer, and the cycle of abuse continues. Regardless of how good it makes us feel, treating just women ensures that problems perpetuate generation after generation. Finally, studies have shown that sociopaths have a sixth sense for picking out people already scarred by fear. Teaching women a distorted view of their own victimhood makes them afraid and makes them more susceptible to the real predators out there. So we can see the cost in human lives in exaggerating and falsifying threats to women. We can see the cost to marginalized groups of people, and we can see the cost to male victims. But there is another cost, a hidden one. Earlier in this speech, I spoke about my experience of living with fear. I described how the word phobia is derived from the Latin angre, which means to choke, throttle, and strangle, and how apt a description that is for the life I lived before I had the tools to control my fear. My fear compelled me to run from opportunity, run from the outside world, run from freedom, essentially. And it invited me to be afraid of all of these things by turning innocuous situations and places into malevolent forces arrayed against me. And yet, I think my fear, as restricting, confining, and abusive as it was, saved me a worse fate. You see, when I tell people what I'm afraid of, nobody says to me, "Ooh, that makes sense. You should be afraid of that." They may be sympathetic to my suffering, or they might laugh at how silly it is, but no one I have ever met has ever reinforced it. In fact, I pay for a man to tell me at regular intervals that my fear is ridiculous. Perhaps not in so many words, but there's actually a service for that. It's called a therapist. That's what therapists do. They politely tell you that your fears are ridiculous. And although it's been hard to beat this fear, it can be beaten, in large part because no one is reinforcing it. I can only imagine how much darker my darkest days would have been, and how much longer I would have suffered them had the whole world been telling me to be afraid. But as a woman, the whole world is telling me to be afraid. Everywhere in the West, women are not just invited, but browbeaten into fearing men. I'd like you right now to imagine a scenario, if you will. Imagine a doctor. Let's call him Dr. Knight. And Dr. Knight decided he could save women by painlessly injecting, well, let's say painlessly injecting all the women in North America with a phobia similar to mine. A phobia of people and situations in a society that they would otherwise regard as neutral or innocuous or even supportive, but that this doctor had decided, based on his own research, was dangerous to women. I imagine that if Dr. Knight said he was doing it for women's own good, giving them this fear of what they would usually regard as an innocuous situation, to save them from the potential harm. I'd imagine if he said that he was doing it for women's own good, you, listening now, would say, I have to see some pretty solid evidence that what you're conditioning women to be afraid of is worth destroying their quality of life over. We need some good proof here, Dr. Knight. I'd imagine you'd ask for lots of statistical evidence. You'd weigh it very carefully, and you'd probably be looking primarily to refute it. If you really met a Dr. Knight, most people would just take his bloody medical license away and throw him in jail. I mean, come on, who conditions women to feel fear of innocuous things? Who takes it upon themselves to do something like that without first subjecting his research and findings to the strictest standards of evidence and outside review? Outside review by a hostile review panel, a group of people who want to poke holes in Dr. Knight's findings, who want to make sure, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that he is in fact correct. In fact, if you were judging Dr. Knight's proposal right now, how much evidence would you need to say yes? Yes, let's inject women with fear. Now, take a moment, just let this settle in your brain, and ask yourself, how much evidence would you need to say no? This is not a good idea, Dr. Knight. This is a really bad idea. First, do no harm, right? And the irony in all this is that we are injecting women with toxic fear. We are inducing as devastating a phobia as the one I lived with for 28 years, not just in one woman or some women, but all women. We are constantly reinforcing it as legitimate in academia, government, and all kinds of sponsored ad campaigns, ensuring women never escape because they always have someone saying, it's a totally legitimate fear. No one in the mainstream media or in academia is questioning this. No one even stops themselves to ask, what if the statistics I'm pumping out aren't actually true? What if they're just a half-truth? Unbelievably, just like our good doctor, Dr. Knight, no one has ever had to justify creating campaigns of fear targeting women. No one has ever had to go to a review board, much less a hostile review board, interested in falsifying their evidence and justify launching a campaign of fear against women. No one who's involved in this has ever looked at the statistics for men and evaluated them with the same weight as those for women. And if anyone questions these campaigns of fear targeting women, they're labeled a misogynist. Love is hate. War is peace. Freedom is slavery. Having lived through a life tortured by fear, it really pisses me off to say or to see people do this to women without a second thought. I have succumbed to the compulsion to fear men, even after I had been researching men's issues for a decade. I was in a back parking lot in a rougher area of Calgary in a back alley. I had just finished a jiu-jitsu class and it was getting dark, and I was going to my car to go home. Absolutely nothing happened, but I remember being afraid anyway, being afraid that this is a perfect setup for a rape. As I scurried, head down, using furtive movements to my car, now I know unintentionally doing everything that makes me look like the perfect victim, I had a moment of clarity in amongst all of that fear. It was just this remarkable moment where it was like an encyclopedia article opened up in my brain and outpoured all of these facts. And one of the facts I'd learned was something I'd learned researching men's issues, and that flooded into my mind. Most of the men who rape were raped themselves. In fact, the majority who go on to sexually abuse others were themselves abused as minors by adult women. Not just that, but there are numerous studies now suggesting men face significant rates of sexual abuse, and startlingly, most of it is by women. In that moment, when those facts came flooding in, I felt as if a weight had lifted off my shoulders. And I never realized I had been carrying it, because I had never noticed it until the moment that it was gone. And in place of that weight flooded a confidence that I had never felt before.